November 1974, Hoboken, New Jersey. The rain fell in sheets against the windows of a small bar called the Clam Broth House on Newark Street, an establishment that had seen better days in a city that had seen better decades. Inside, a 23-year-old waitress named Maria Consuela Rivera wiped down the empty tables while the jukebox sat silent in the corner, unplugged to save electricity during the slow Tuesday night shift. The owner had gone home early, leaving Maria alone to close up a bar that rarely saw more than a dozen customers anymore in a neighborhood that was slowly dying around it. She had no idea that the next 30 minutes would change her life forever. Maria had been working at the Clam Broth House for 2 years, ever since dropping out of the Manhattan School of Music, when her father's illness had drained the family's savings and forced her to abandon dreams that had once seemed destined to come true. She had grown up singing in church choirs, had won local talent competitions throughout her teenage years, and had been accepted to one of the most prestigious music programs in the country before reality intervened, with the cruelty that life reserves for those who dare to dream too big. The bar was empty, except for Maria and the ghosts of customers past, who seemed to linger in the worn leather booths and the scratched wooden floor that had witnessed decades of celebrations and sorrows. She finished wiping the last table and looked around at the space that had become her prison, a holding cell where her dreams came to die a little more each night, while she served drinks to men who had forgotten what hope felt like. Without thinking about what she was doing, Maria walked behind the bar and turned on the old sound system that the owner used for background music during busier nights. But instead of playing a record, she picked up the microphone that sat unused near the cash register, a relic from the days when the bar had hosted live entertainment before the neighborhood's decline made such luxuries unsustainable. She closed her eyes and began to sing, her voice filling the empty room with a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul, where the music she had abandoned still lived despite her best efforts to silence it forever. The song was an old standard, one she had learned from her grandmother, who had emigrated from Puerto Rico with nothing but a suitcase and a voice that could make angels weep with its beauty. What Maria did not know was that a black limousine had pulled up outside the Clam Broth House approximately 3 minutes before she began singing, its arrival unnoticed because she had been in the back room gathering cleaning supplies. The passenger had instructed his driver to wait while he stepped inside the bar, where he had spent countless hours during his youth, before fame had taken him far from the streets of Hoboken that had formed the foundation of everything he would become. Frank Sinatra stood in the shadows near the back entrance, having slipped in through a door that he remembered from 50 years of visits to this establishment that had been a second home during his teenage years, when he was just another kid from the neighborhood with impossible dreams and a voice that would not be silenced. He had come to Hoboken that night on a sentimental journey, visiting the places of his youth while dealing with the melancholy that sometimes overtook him in his later years. The voice he heard stopped him in his tracks with a force that felt almost physical, like a hand pressing against his chest and commanding him to listen with every fiber of his being. It was raw, untrained in the classical sense, but possessed of something that Sinatra recognized immediately because he had heard it only a handful of times in his nearly 60 years of experience in the music industry. It was the voice of someone who was born to sing. Maria continued her song, unaware of the legendary figure standing in the darkness behind her, her eyes still closed as she poured emotions into the music that she normally kept locked away in the deepest chambers of her heart. The melody rose and fell with the natural rhythm of someone who understood instinctively how to shape a phrase, how to breathe life into words that might otherwise remain lifeless on the page. Sinatra moved silently to a booth in the back corner of the bar, sliding into the worn leather seat that had cradled him countless times during his youth, when the Clam Broth House was a gathering place for the Italian families of the neighborhood. He watched the young woman sing with an intensity that surprised even him, a man who had thought he had seen everything the world of music had to offer during his legendary career. The song ended, and Maria opened her eyes to find herself still alone in the empty bar, or so she believed. She felt slightly embarrassed by her moment of weakness, singing to no one in a closed establishment, like a fool who had not yet accepted that her dreams were dead and buried beneath the weight of responsibilities that left no room for such indulgences. She was about to turn off the sound system when a voice emerged from the darkness of the back booth, a voice that every American would have recognized instantly if they had been present to hear it speak those simple words that would change everything for Maria Consuela Rivera. The voice said that she should not stop, that he had not heard a voice like that in 20 years, and that she should sing another song while he listened. Maria froze, her hand still extended toward the power switch, her mind refusing to process what her ears were telling her about the identity of the speaker who had somehow appeared in a bar that had been empty moments before. She turned slowly toward the back of the room and saw a figure rising from the booth, moving into the dim light that illuminated the center of the bar. The face that emerged from the shadows was unmistakable, a face that had graced magazine covers and movie screens and album jackets for longer than Maria had been alive. Frank Sinatra was standing in the clam broth house, and he was looking directly at her with an expression that seemed to contain equal parts curiosity and recognition. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in that empty bar in Hoboken in November 1974 involves one of the greatest voices in music history, a young waitress who had abandoned her dreams, and a chance encounter that would prove that destiny sometimes finds us in the most unexpected places. By the end of this story, you will understand why Frank Sinatra believed in miracles and why he spent the last decades of his life trying to repay a debt to the neighborhood that had made him who he was. Francis Albert Sinatra had been born in Hoboken on December 12, 1915, in a cold-water flat at 415 Monroe Street, just a few blocks from where the Clam Broth House would later become one of his favorite haunts during the years when he was still just Frankie Sinatra, the skinny kid with the big dreams and the voice that made girls swoon at local dances. His birth had been difficult, nearly killing both him and his mother Dolly, and had left him with scars on his face and neck that would mark him for life. The Hoboken of Sinatra's youth was a city of immigrants, primarily Italian and Irish families who had crossed the Atlantic seeking opportunities that the old world could not provide. The streets were rough, the work was hard, and dreams of escape were the currency that kept people going through winters that seemed endless, and summers that offered little relief from the grinding poverty that defined most lives in the neighborhood. Sinatra had escaped through his voice, a gift that he had cultivated with obsessive dedication from his teenage years, when he would stand outside clubs listening to the bands play, absorbing everything he could about phrasing and timing and the mysterious alchemy that transformed words into emotions that could move audiences to tears or joy. He had studied Bing Crosby's records until he knew every breath, every pause, every subtle inflection that made the difference between singing and artistry. The journey from Hoboken to Hollywood had taken decades and had included moments of triumph and despair that would have broken lesser men who lacked Sinatra's combination of talent and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He had been on top of the world in the 1940s, had crashed spectacularly in the early 1950s, and had rebuilt himself through sheer force of will into something even greater than he had been before. By 1974, Sinatra was approaching his 60th birthday and had begun to feel the weight of years that had included 4 marriages, countless relationships, legendary performances and controversies that would have destroyed the careers of artists with less talent and fewer loyal fans. He had announced a retirement in 1971 that lasted only 2 years before the stage called him back to the life that was the only one he truly understood. The sentimental journey to Hoboken that November night had been prompted by news that the Clam Broth House might close permanently, a casualty of the neighborhood's decline that had accelerated since the Holland Tunnel had redirected traffic away from the waterfront streets where Sinatra had spent his youth. He had wanted to see the old place one more time before it disappeared like so many other landmarks of his childhood. What he found instead was Maria Consuela Rivera, a young woman whose voice reminded him of everything he had once felt about music before fame had complicated his relationship with the art that had defined his life. Her sound was not polished, not refined by years of training, but it possessed an authenticity that could not be taught, and that most professional singers spent their careers trying to achieve without success. Maria stood frozen as Sinatra approached her, her mind still refusing to accept the reality of what was happening in the empty bar, where she had expected to spend another lonely night cleaning tables and mourning dreams that had died before they could fully bloom. The man walking toward her was a legend, a figure so far removed from her daily existence that his presence seemed almost supernatural. Sinatra introduced himself unnecessarily, a habit he had developed over the years, because he genuinely believed that courtesy cost nothing and might mean everything to someone who was nervous in his presence. He extended his hand, and Maria shook it with a grip that trembled slightly, despite her best efforts to appear composed in front of the most famous entertainer of the 20th century. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, extending well past the time when Maria should have closed the bar and gone home to the small apartment she shared with her ailing father, in a building that had seen better days. Sinatra wanted to know everything about her, where she had come from, where she had trained, why she was working in a bar, instead of pursuing the career that her voice clearly deserved. Maria told him about the Manhattan School of Music, about her father's illness, about the dreams she had packed away in boxes that she no longer had the courage to open, because looking at what might have been was too painful to bear. She spoke with an honesty that surprised her, opened by the genuine interest that Sinatra showed in her story, and by the surreal nature of the situation that made normal social barriers seem irrelevant. Sinatra listened with the attention of a man who had spent his life studying voices and the people behind them, recognizing in Maria's story echoes of his own journey from poverty to stardom, and understanding that talent without opportunity was a tragedy that repeated itself in cities across America every day. He had been lucky, blessed with the right breaks at the right times, and he knew that luck was not evenly distributed. When Maria finished her story, Sinatra was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes fixed on some distant point as he considered what he had heard and what he was about to offer. He had made spontaneous gestures before, helping struggling artists who reminded him of his younger self, but something about Maria felt different, more significant, as if destiny had arranged their meeting for purposes that transcended simple charity. He told Maria that he wanted to help her, that he would pay for her to complete her studies at the Manhattan School of Music, and would arrange for her to audition for recording executives who owed him favors accumulated over decades of being Frank Sinatra in an industry built on relationships and obligations. He asked only that she promise to never stop singing, to never let circumstances silence the gift that she had been given. Maria began to cry, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was being offered by a stranger who had walked into her empty bar and heard something in her voice that she had stopped believing existed. She tried to refuse to explain that she could not accept such generosity from someone she had just met. But Sinatra waved away her objections with the authority of a man accustomed to having his decisions accepted without argument. The next morning, Maria received a phone call from a woman who identified herself as Frank Sinatra's personal assistant and who explained that arrangements were already being made for Maria's return to the Manhattan School of Music, with all expenses paid through a foundation that Sinatra had established years earlier to help young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue their dreams. The following months transformed Maria's life in ways that she could not have imagined during those lonely nights at the clam broth house, when the future had seemed like an endless repetition of the present. She returned to her studies with a dedication born of the knowledge that someone believed in her enough to invest in her potential, a gift that carried responsibilities she was determined to honor. Sinatra called her occasionally during that first year, checking on her progress with the casual interest of a mentor who wanted to ensure that his investment was paying dividends. Their conversations were brief but meaningful, focused on her development as an artist and on the opportunities that were beginning to emerge as she progressed through her training. The audition that Sinatra had promised came in the spring of 1976, arranged through connections that only someone of his stature could have activated on behalf of an unknown singer from Hoboken. Maria performed for executives at Reprise Records, the label that Sinatra had founded in 1961, and that remained part of his empire despite various corporate reorganizations over the years. The recording contract that followed was modest by industry standards, but it represented everything that Maria had dreamed about during the years when such dreams had seemed impossibly distant from her reality as a waitress in a dying neighborhood. Her debut album was released in 1977, to reviews that praised her voice, while acknowledging that she was still developing as an artist. Sinatra attended the album release party in Los Angeles, his presence lending credibility to an unknown artist who might otherwise have been overlooked by an industry that valued established names over emerging talent. He introduced her to people who mattered, spoke about her voice with the authority of someone whose opinion on such matters was considered definitive. The career that followed was not legendary in the way that Sinatra's had been, but it was respectable and fulfilling in ways that Maria had stopped believing possible during those dark years at the Clam Broth House. She recorded 6 albums over the following 15 years, toured nationally, and built a following among audiences who appreciated the emotional authenticity that had first caught Sinatra's attention in that empty bar. Maria's father lived long enough to see his daughter succeed, his illness stabilizing in ways that doctors attributed partly to the improved medical care that Sinatra's generosity had made possible. He died in 1982, surrounded by family, and with the knowledge that his daughter's dreams had not died with his own declining health. The relationship between Maria and Sinatra evolved over the years from mentor and protege to something resembling family, the kind of connection that forms between people who recognize in each other something essential that transcends the circumstances of their meeting. She was invited to his birthday celebrations, included in gatherings that brought together the people who mattered most, to a man whose circle had shrunk as age claimed more of his contemporaries. When Sinatra performed his final concerts in the 1990s, Maria was in the audience, watching from seats that he had reserved for people whose presence meant something beyond the commercial value of celebrity attendance. She watched him struggle with lyrics that had once flowed effortlessly, his voice diminished, but still capable of moments that reminded everyone why he had been called the Voice. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, at the age of 82, after a life that had included more triumph and tragedy than most people experience in 10 lifetimes. Maria was not present at his deathbed, that privilege reserved for family and the closest of friends, but she learned of his passing within hours and wept for the man who had changed her life in an empty bar 24 years earlier. The funeral was a spectacle befitting the most celebrated entertainer of the 20th century, attended by celebrities, politicians, and ordinary fans who lined the streets to pay their respects to a man who had provided the soundtrack for their lives. Maria watched the proceedings from a distance, a private mourner in a sea of public grief. In the years following Sinatra's death, Maria dedicated herself to continuing the work he had begun, establishing her own foundation to help young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue dreams that might otherwise remain unrealized. She told the story of her discovery countless times, never tiring of recounting the miracle that had occurred in the Clam Broth House on that rainy November night. The Clam Broth House itself closed in 1978, 4 years after the night when Sinatra had walked in and discovered Maria singing alone in the empty room. The building was eventually demolished, replaced by a structure that bore no memory of what had occurred within its walls, but Maria kept photographs that she displayed prominently in her home. Hoboken transformed over the decades following Sinatra's death, gentrifying into a trendy suburb of Manhattan that attracted young professionals who knew the city primarily as Frank Sinatra's birthplace, rather than as the working-class immigrant neighborhood it had been during his youth. The streets where he had walked were now lined with expensive restaurants and boutiques. Maria Consuela Rivera continued performing into her 60s, her voice deepening with age but retaining the emotional authenticity that had first caught Sinatra's attention when she was a 23-year-old waitress with abandoned dreams and a heart that still believed in music, despite everything life had done to silence it. She married twice, raised 3 children, and built a life that balanced the demands of a performing career with the responsibilities of family in ways that Sinatra himself had struggled to achieve during his own tumultuous personal history. Her children grew up hearing stories about the night that changed everything, a family legend that connected them to entertainment history. The foundation Maria established in Sinatra's memory has helped dozens of young artists pursue their dreams, providing scholarships, mentorship, and the kind of support that can make the difference between potential realized and talent wasted. Each success story adds another layer to the legacy that began with a chance encounter in an empty bar. Documentary filmmakers have approached Maria multiple times over the years, seeking to tell the story of her discovery in formats that might reach wider audiences than her own performances. She has participated in several such projects, always emphasizing that the true hero of the story was Frank Sinatra, and his willingness to help a stranger, simply because he recognized something in her voice that reminded him of his own journey. The music industry has changed dramatically since that November night in 1974, transformed by technologies and business models that Sinatra could not have imagined during his lifetime. But the fundamental truth that Maria's story illustrates remains constant. Talent needs opportunity to flourish, and those who have achieved success have the power to create opportunities for those who come after them. Frank Sinatra's legacy includes not only his recordings and films, but also the lives he touched through acts of generosity that were often unknown to the public during his lifetime. Maria was not the only beneficiary of his philanthropic impulses, but her story has become one of the most frequently told examples of his commitment to helping others achieve dreams that might otherwise remain unrealized. The empty bar where it all began exists now only in photographs and memories, a location that has been erased from the physical landscape of Hoboken, but that continues to live in the stories told about what happened there on a rainy November night when destiny brought together a legendary singer and an unknown waitress whose voice refused to be silenced. Maria's final album, released in 2010, included a track dedicated to Frank Sinatra, a song about gratitude and the mysterious ways that lives intersect to create opportunities that seem, in retrospect, almost miraculous. The recording received positive reviews and reminded listeners of the story behind the artist they had come to appreciate over 3 decades. The children and grandchildren of Maria Consuela Rivera have inherited not only her musical talents, but also her commitment to helping others, a value that she traces directly to the generosity that Frank Sinatra showed her when she had nothing to offer in return, except a voice and a dream that she had almost abandoned completely. The night of Maria's discovery has been recounted in numerous interviews, articles, and tribute programs dedicated to exploring the lesser-known aspects of Frank Sinatra's legacy beyond his music and films. Each retelling adds new details that Maria remembers or emphasizes different aspects of what occurred in those transformative hours at the Clam Broth House. Sinatra's driver that night, a man named Vincent Caruso, who had worked for the singer for 15 years, later recalled waiting in the limousine for nearly 4 hours while his employer remained inside the bar. Vincent had grown accustomed to Sinatra's unpredictable schedule, but even he was surprised by the length of the visit to a place that should have been a brief nostalgic stop. The owner of the Clam Broth House, an elderly Italian man named Giuseppe Martini, learned about what had happened in his establishment only the following morning when Maria arrived for her shift, with news that left him speechless for several minutes. He had known Sinatra as a young man, had served him drinks during the early years before fame had taken him away from Hoboken. Giuseppe insisted that Maria take the day off, recognizing that her life had fundamentally changed and that the mundane responsibilities of waitressing were now irrelevant to a future that had suddenly opened with possibilities that neither of them could fully comprehend. He hugged her with the affection of a man who had watched her struggle and who was genuinely happy that her suffering might finally be ending. The news of Sinatra's discovery spread through Hoboken's Italian community within days, passed from family to family with the pride that the neighborhood felt whenever one of their own achieved success that reflected well on the community that had produced them. Maria became a minor celebrity in the neighborhood before her first album was even recorded. Her return to the Manhattan School of Music was marked by a determination that her professors immediately noticed, and that distinguished her from students who had never experienced the loss of their dreams and the miraculous restoration of hope that Maria had undergone. She studied with an intensity that suggested she understood exactly how precious her second chance truly was. The technical training she received during those years refined the raw talent that Sinatra had recognized, adding layers of sophistication to a voice that had already possessed the emotional authenticity that could not be taught. Her instructors recognized that they were working with someone special, a student whose natural gifts required only polishing rather than fundamental development. Sinatra attended Maria's graduation ceremony in 1977, his presence causing a stir among students and faculty who had not expected the legendary entertainer to appear at an academic event that would normally have attracted little attention from the entertainment industry. He sat in the audience like any proud family member, applauding when Maria received her diploma. The photograph of Sinatra and Maria taken after that graduation ceremony became one of her most treasured possessions, a visual record of the relationship that had transformed her life from a trajectory of disappointment into a journey of fulfillment that exceeded her childhood dreams. She displayed the photograph in every home she ever lived in afterward. Maria's debut album was produced by veterans of the music industry who understood Sinatra's expectations and who worked diligently to create a product that would justify the faith he had placed in an unknown artist. The recording sessions were intense, with Maria bringing the same emotional commitment to each take that she had demonstrated in the empty bar. The album sold modestly, but received critical attention that established Maria as a serious artist rather than simply a Sinatra protégé trading on her famous mentor's reputation. Reviewers noted the genuine emotion in her voice and the technical proficiency that her training had developed, predicting a career that would grow as she matured as an artist. Sinatra's own career continued through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, his voice aging but his artistry undiminished by the years that were accumulating faster than he sometimes cared to acknowledge. He incorporated Maria into select performances, duets that showcased both his mentorship and her development as a vocalist. These joint appearances became treasured memories for audiences who witnessed the obvious affection between the legendary entertainer and the young woman whose career he had launched with a spontaneous act of generosity in an empty bar. The chemistry between them was evident, a musical conversation between generations connected by the universal language of song. Maria's subsequent albums explored various styles, from traditional standards that honored her connection to Sinatra's musical legacy to contemporary material that established her own artistic identity separate from her famous mentor. Each release demonstrated growth and evolution that justified the investment Sinatra had made in her potential. The entertainment industry that Maria navigated during the 1980s and 1990s was very different from the one that had shaped Sinatra's career decades earlier, but the fundamental principles remained constant: talent, dedication, and the connections that opened doors that merit alone could not unlock. Maria benefited from all three. Her concert performances developed a devoted following among audiences who appreciated the emotional honesty that characterized every song she sang, the same quality that Sinatra had recognized in her voice during that first, unexpected encounter. Critics noted that she never seemed to be merely performing, but rather sharing something genuine with everyone present. The charitable work that Maria began in the 1990s was directly inspired by Sinatra's example, an attempt to repay the gift she had received by creating similar opportunities for others whose talents might otherwise go undiscovered and undeveloped. The foundation she established has helped launch numerous careers over the decades since. The story of the empty bar in Hoboken has become part of the larger narrative about Frank Sinatra's complicated legacy, a reminder that the man famous for his temper and his demanding nature was also capable of extraordinary kindness towards strangers who caught his attention in the right moment. Maria's success validates his judgment and his generosity in equal measure. Rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra. The voice that defined an era of American music also listened that night in Hoboken, hearing something in a young woman's song that reminded you of everything you had believed about the power of talent to transcend circumstances. Maria Consuela Rivera never forgot what you did for her, and through her foundation and her example, your generosity continues to create opportunities for dreamers who might otherwise never get the chance to discover what their voices can become when someone believes in them enough to open doors that would otherwise remain forever closed.